Living in Virginia, you're in the fast lane on the information superhighway. We've invested $3 billion in Virginia's broadband network to give you one of the fastest internet connection speeds in the world, so you can build relationships, bring new business to our state, and meet the future of education. It's amazing what we can do together. Visit VCTA.com to learn how broadband connects the Commonwealth.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the VCTA Broadband Association and Comcast, connecting Virginians to their government. Please welcome Delegate Mark Cole. Good to see you, Mark.
Well, it's good to be here with you again.
Let's see, we're one day past the decision day, so to speak, crossover.
Yep.
What does that mean?
Well, that's just the day that each body has to be done with their own legislation. On the House side, we have to be done with all of our work on House bills and pass them and cross them over or send them over to the Senate. And the Senate has to do the same thing. They have to be done with all Senate bills and then send the ones that passed over to the House.
So if you have a bill that passed to the Senate, you'll have to go represent that?
Yeah. The way it works is, of course, I'm in the House, so all my bills start out in the House. They go to committee and sometimes subcommittee. They have to pass each step of the way to proceed to the next one. Starting in subcommittee, it has to pass out of subcommittee. Then it goes to full committee, and if it passes out of full committee, then it goes to the House floor. And if it passes the House floor, then it goes over to the Senate, and the same thing happens again, where it goes into committee and has to be heard all over again.
Well, let's talk about one of the more significant things that occurred last year, but will have to occur this year in identical language.
Yes.
And that's the redistricting bill. Talk to us about, first of all, what it contains, where it stands now, and how do you think things will wind up?
Well, I hope we'll pass it again. It's a constitutional amendment, and the way constitutional, for the state constitution, not the U.S. Constitution, the way state constitutional amendments work is they have to be passed by the legislature twice and then voted on by the voters.
And does there have to be an intervening election?
Yes, there has to be an election in between the two votes by the General Assembly. And of course, we had the election last year. Last session we passed. What it is it's a constitutional amendment to set up an independent bipartisan commission to do redistricting. Every 10 years, we have to redraw all the district lines, the legislative lines and the congressional lines, based on the new census data, because every 10 years the U.S. takes a census, and all the districts are supposed to be approximately equal in population. So that's why we have to do redistricting every 10 years. And it's the legislature's responsibility to draw the state districts and also the congressional districts. Of course, that, since you got elected officials drawing the districts, that always opens the door to gerrymandering, drawing districts to favor certain political parties or certain candidates, and that's been a big complaint for years. It's as old as the country is. I mean, back before we were even a country, when they had representatives in each state, there were charges of gerrymandering. And what we're trying to do to minimize that is set up an independent commission with an equal number of Republicans, equal number of Democrats, also has citizen members that aren't elected officials, to come up with the redistricting plan to try to take as much of the politics out of it as you can. But since it's a constitutional amendment, it has to pass, it passed last year and it has to pass again this year. And if it passes again this year, it will be on the ballot in November for the voters to decide if they want to approve it or not. I'm pretty sure if it gets to the voters that it will be approved, because the polling says, it has overwhelming support. However, since we have a new majority in charge of the General Assembly now, some of them are kind of reconsidering their previous support of it because, not to get overly political, but the Democrats are in charge of state government right now. And some of them would like to be able to draw the districts the way they want instead of trying to draw it independently without political interference.
So has the constitutional amendment passed the House?
No, it has not. It's funny, some of the enabling legislation for it has passed. However, they're still holding back the actual amendment. And they do have about another week before it expires. So I'm hopeful that they will pass it out in the next week or so.
So crossover has no impact on constitutional amendments?
No, the way the rules are set up, the resolutions have a longer shelf life, if you will, and so they do have another week or so before they have to act on it or let it die. And I'm hopeful that they will act on it. However, they've also passed another bill that I oppose that sets up an advisory commission to basically make recommendations on it, but then the legislature would still be in charge of the redistricting process. And that's really, I think, just a fig leaf. It's not real reform, and they've also passed that. So I don't know if there's some gamesmanship going on, but I hope that they will proceed with the constitutional amendment.
Is there a Senate companion resolution?
Yes, there is a Senate companion, and I believe the Senate has passed theirs, so we will have a second bite at it. But if they don't pass the House resolution, I'm kind of doubtful that they would pass the Senate resolution.
Now, does any of the enabling legislation provide a criteria for that bipartisan commission to look at?
It absolutely does, and it covers all the issues that people have raised as far as discrimination based on race or ethnicity and all that, and gender and everything else. So there are protections there, and plus, you've always got the courts looking over your shoulder as well, and so we're doing our best to make sure that, one, it's a legal redistricting process, but also we want to be fair about it as well.
Yeah, because there's been over the last 10 years a lot of litigation here in Virginia.
Yeah, it seems like no matter what you do,
right,
somebody's always going to file a lawsuit somewhere, and that was the case this last redistricting, even though the last redistricting was a bipartisan effort. True, it wasn't an independent commission or anything like that did it, but at the time, 10 years ago, the House was Republican and the Senate was Democrat, so we had to agree on it. And so, like I said, it was a bipartisan effort. The U.S. Justice Department, which at that time was headed up by Eric Holder, gave it a thumbs up and approved it, but that still didn't stop people from challenging it in court.
Do you recall the vote in the House on the constitutional amendment?
From last year? Yeah, it was overwhelming. There were very few votes against it. Both parties supported it overwhelmingly last year. And like I said, since Democrats are now in the majority now, and they have total control, some of them are having second thoughts about handing control of the process over to an independent commission.
Now, if the independent commission can't agree, as I understand it goes to the Virginia Supreme Court?
That's correct. That's kind of the fail-safe. They get two cracks at it. They come up with a plan, and if the legislature rejects the plan, they can go back and try it again, and if the second plan is rejected, then it goes to the Virginia Supreme Court to draw the lines. And so and they have to follow the same criteria and everything that we would. And they're supposed to be a nonpartisan body, and so I'm hopeful. That's kind of the fail-safe.
Right.
I can't imagine that it would get to that, but if it did, that would be the fail-safe.
Now, there are a number of other matters that came out of privileges and elections so far that I know you opposed.
Yeah.
The Equal Rights Amendment, for example.
Yeah.
There have been some changing to our voting laws.
Yeah.
Talk to us about some of those issues.
Yeah, well, the Equal Rights Amendment, guys with gray hair like me and you can remember it back in the 70s when it first came out. And it looked like it was submitted in 1972, and Congress put a 7-year deadline on it, which was common for constitutional amendments back then. And so it was supposed to have been ratified by 1979. And it looked like it was speeding towards ratification. 35 states ratified it, and it needed 38. And then there were concerns raised about potential unintended consequences of the amendment, because the language of the amendment was very broad and it didn't have any exceptions. So there were concerns that it might do away with separate programs for boys and girls in public schools and even sports teams and things like that, and separate dormitories at our public colleges and universities, because, like I said, the language was very broad and had no exceptions. So once those concerns were raised, not only did no new states ratify it, but 5 states that had previously ratified it rescinded their ratification. And so when the 79 deadline was approaching, Congress extended it for another 3 years to 1982, and then when the second deadline approached in 1982, no new states had ratified it, and so Congress just let it expire. And so it expired, it basically died in 1982. Now what happened was in 1992, the 27th Amendment to the Constitution, which dealt with congressional pay, was ratified. And that was an amendment that was originally submitted like 200 years prior. The difference was that Congress didn't put a deadline on that one, where they did put a deadline on the ERA. But when that amendment was ratified, that got kind of the ERA proponents said, hey, if they can ratify a 200-year-old amendment, we ought to be able to go ahead and ratify ours. And so that started a new push for the old ERA. And so they went ahead and they ignored the deadline expiration. They ignored the fact that 5 states rescinded their ratification and went on and said, hey, we just need 3 states. And so anyways, Virginia became the 3rd state to ratify it, quote, this year. And so, the proponents were all celebrating and stuff, but then the archivist of the U.S. and the U.S. Justice Department said, no, sorry, it expired decades ago. It's not becoming part of the Constitution. Now, I will say, I think everybody supports equal rights, and men and women already have equal rights under the Constitution. Federal courts have ruled that the 14th Amendment grants women equal rights. That's why more than 20 years ago, VMI was ordered to start admitting women to the institution. And also, they bring up issues like equal pay. Well, equal pay has been in federal law since 1963, and it's been in state law since 1974. So if anybody is discriminating based on pay against men and women for the same work, they're already breaking state and federal law. So again, I think the ERA was kind of a cause célèbre that really, I think generated a lot of political interest for certain campaigns and things, but really it expired decades ago, and for them to propose a new amendment, it needs to go through Congress again and be submitted to the states for ratification.
We could probably spend the rest of our time on what has come out of privileges and elections, but I know you have some other issues, especially in terms of the district you represent, relating to transportation.
That's right. That's right. I had legislation this year to change how VDOT and the Commonwealth Transportation Board scores transportation projects. They go through a scoring called Smart Scale. Yep, Smart Scale on what projects they'll fund. And currently there's limitations on it so that they only consider traffic counts for the work week. And as you know, living
Yes.
in our area there, that traffic does not take time off on Saturday and Sunday. In
Sometimes
our
it's
area.
even worse.
Yes, it is. I-95, especially on Sundays, it's like rush hour all day long. And so I had legislation to change the criteria to try to make them consider all 7 days of traffic instead of just 5 days of traffic, and also expand what they consider a commute, because they were putting kind of like time limits on it and stuff instead of mileage and things like that, and that I think hurts our area. And so while that bill did not pass, VDOT did get up and say, hey, we're taking all these things under consideration and we're going to do our best to try to accommodate it. So sometimes legislation can accomplish its purpose without actually passing. So I'm hopeful that the VDOT and the Commonwealth Transportation Board are going to revise how they score these projects, because I think the number one criteria should be congestion relief. And a lot of times that's not the top consideration.
What about the ability to have a local taxing authority? I think another one of your colleagues had proposed that as well.
Yeah, and there's some areas that have that. Northern Virginia has what they call a regional transportation authority, and Hampton Roads does as well, that all the localities, they kick in certain tax monies to fund regional projects. That has been talked about in the Fredericksburg area for a few years now. But for something like that to work, the localities need to get behind it and really request it and come up with a structure that they're willing to pay into for something like that to get off the ground. And so far, our localities have not really requested that.
I guess it does give a locality or a region a little bit more leverage because you bring additional money to the table.
That's the main advantage to it. But the localities, they can already put in their own money into these projects, and we do have, though it's not a taxing authority or anything like that, we do have the Fredericksburg Area Metropolitan Planning Organization, which does coordinate regional transportation projects. A lot of the projects you're seeing now on I-95 in our area went through the FAMPO process and stuff, and so it's not like the localities aren't already cooperating and on these regional projects. They certainly are. What they're wanting, though, is some additional funding, and you would probably need a transportation authority to do something like that.
As we continue to try to diversify our economy, how difficult is it to continue to do that with this type of traffic congestion?
Yeah, it's definitely an issue, but right now it doesn't seem like it's an overriding issue, because the employers and the retailers and a lot of the businesses, they're attracted to your population centers. Because they figure that's going to give them more customers, more access, and things like that. So while traffic is definitely an issue and may discourage some, it's not an overwhelming factor right now. Heck, Amazon,
yes.
They decided to relocate up in Northern Virginia, Crystal City, one of the worst traffic areas in the country. It didn't discourage them from locating there. So that's transportation is definitely an issue. We're working on to try to get more resources but we need to do it in a smart way.
Now, what about the impact of this new gas tax that the governor wants to impose?
I've seen the bill, and it seems like it's being overly complex. It's creating, instead of just funding the current funds, it's creating some new funds. A lot of the funds are going to go to rail and mass transit and not necessarily roads. So I'm not sure, as far as like our interstate, how much that's going to help Certainly I support rail and mass transit, but our biggest problem right now is the gridlock on our roads, and we need to be addressing that as our top priority. And I'm not sure that this new proposal is going to do that.
And of course, this would be in addition to, somewhat related to the tax that was imposed in the I-81 area.
Yeah. And what it is and this was the governor's plan. It calls for a 12-cent increase in the gas tax over the next 3 years, and then from thereafter, it will adjust based on inflation automatically. I'm not a big fan of automatic tax increases. The legislator, your elected officials, if they're going to raise taxes, they ought to have the courage to step up and say, this is why I did it, and do it. So I'm not a big fan of these automatic tax increases. But like I said, it's not just that. There's a whole lot more in that transportation plan that just kind of, in my mind, aside from the tax increase, puts a big question mark on it in my mind.
Vehicle inspections, for example.
Yeah, the vehicle inspections, the governor wanted to eliminate those. I heard from a lot of people in the public that didn't think that was a good idea. So kind of as a compromise, it's going from 1-year inspections to 2-year inspections, which I think is probably a reasonable compromise.
Some people suggest that this gas tax increase is a transition to something else. Given the fact that we have more fuel efficiency, there's going to be more electric cars on the road, and maybe we should go to some type of mileage system.
That's been talked about for years, that you go basically on a miles tax somehow. And some countries, like I think Great Britain, are doing something like that, where you get taxed every time you drive into London. And it's almost kind of like a automatic road tolling system. There are a lot of concerns about that as far as privacy concerns, how it's going to affect commuters, and people that may have to drive for work and stuff like that. So, while that's definitely being debated and talked about, I think we're still a ways away from that. Something that I've advocated for is taking a little bit more of the current sales tax and dedicating it to transportation. That way, you're right. The gas tax, it has not been growing because we've been, and it's a good thing, we've been producing more fuel-efficient vehicles and electric vehicles, hybrids, and all that. And certainly, that's a good thing. But the end result ends up that there's less money for roads, and so we do need to kind of come up with a new funding source for that. And like I said, I've been an advocate of taking a portion of the current sales tax and dedicating more of it to transportation.
Have commuters gotten used to the high occupancy toll lanes, or do you still get complaints about it?
Occasionally I'll get complaints about it, but I think they have, it seems to have become a little more accepted because it did reduce some of the traffic on the regular lanes too, as people use the toll lanes, the hot lanes. But there are concerns about the fairness of it and how the tolls can escalate and stuff based on traffic and all. So those are certainly concerns. And really, they came about because of a failure, I think, of the Commonwealth Transportation Board and VDOT. They had, we used to have the HOV lanes, and they ended in Prince William County for decades. And you'd go ask VDOT, well, when are you going to extend it further south? And they'd just say, we have no plan to. And so that allowed Transurban to come in and say, hey, we'll do it, but there's going to be a price. And so really, I've been trying to, on the CTB, trying to get them and VDOT to come up with a strategic plan to address the congestion on I-95.
There's a huge compensation issue for our state police, and
yes.
I know you have a fairly large budget amendment to deal with that.
Yeah, the state police, they have critical shortages. Their pay is just not kept up with the market, so I do have a budget amendment in to give them a 3% raise. I don't know if that's going to be accepted or not, but they're down, more than 200 people statewide, and they're having problems recruiting and filling those positions. And whenever you have that, it's an indication that you've allowed your salaries and compensation to fall below market.
And of course, the local sheriffs have a similar problem, but at least they get part of their funding from
Yeah,
their
the localities, your local law enforcement, whether you have a police department or sheriff's department, they do get state money, but they also get a large portion of their funds from the local government. And so while you do have issues there, it's more easily addressed by the localities to be able to set the pay scales there.
Is this a much more significant problem in our rural areas of the state?
Yeah, I think it is, but also, the state troopers are having a hard time making ends meet in Northern Virginia. Because the cost of living there is so high, and even in our area, and that's why we have what's called the cost of competing program, where the state provides more funding for those positions because they're in such a high cost area.
Now, what about this move to increase the minimum wage?
I think that's going to be bad for a lot of our businesses and a lot of our entry-level employees. People complain about the minimum wage. Well, first, very few people in our area are paid the minimum wage. The market has kind of eclipsed that. Even McDonald's now, they're paying $8, $9 an hour for their people. If they have to go up to $15 an hour, I think you're going to find fewer job opportunities for teenagers and people just unskilled labor just trying to enter the workforce. And you're going to see more automation. You're already seeing it at a lot of the McDonald's. They're coming up with these touch screens where you place their order, and that's because in some other states and localities they already went to a $15 minimum wage, and so they're cutting back on the number of employees because they just don't have the money to pay these people $15 an hour.
Again, something that could have a more significant impact in rural areas, although I understand, at least on the Senate side, that part of that bill tries to regionalize those increases.
That's right. People complain, well, you can't support a family on $15 an hour. Well, yeah, but those jobs, those entry-level jobs, are not intended for people to be able to support a family. Like I said, they're entry level for young people entering the job market or for a secondary income. I know some retirees, they'll go work for Chick-fil-A or something like that just because they want to make some extra spending money or to try to make ends meet. And if you go make the cost of that labor too high, there's just going to be fewer jobs and fewer opportunities for that low-skilled labor.
30 seconds from your perspective for your constituents. What will success look like at the end of this session?
Well, I hope we don't pass too much bad legislation that's going to hurt the economy and hurt their job prospects. I think the economy's doing fairly well right now. We're almost at full employment. Wages are up, and I just hope that we don't do anything that's going to derail that.
Thank you, Delegate Marco. Good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the VCTA Broadband Association and Comcast. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans.
Mm-hmm.